Hello and welcome, my partners in crime. How lovely to see you all again. Now listen, today's case is an unsolved case. I wrote this case and researched this case before I took time off, and then I got a message from a lady called Wendy, so hello Wendy, and she reminded me of this case, and this case is Lee Boxell Case. And so I'd already wrote it, and I think that I had put up that I was going to do them, so I'm going to start now doing the sort of backlog of cases. So I want to give you a bit of an overview of this case because it is an old case. It's a 1988 case, and the young lad was only 15 when he disappeared. And to tell the truth, there's been no sight or hair of him since his disappearance. So anyway, Darren Boxell was born on the 16th of February 1973. He was a British schoolboy who disappeared from London Borough of Sutton in England on the 10th of September 1988, and he was aged 15 at the time. He was last seen in Sutton High Street before saying he might go and watch a football match at Selhurst Park in Croydon. Now, at this time of his disappearance, he was described as being about 5'7", 170 centimetres tall, slim build, light brown hair, good looking lad, really, to tell the truth. He was wearing black jeans, white like Flintstones T-shirt and brown suede shoes. Now, despite the police's massive, really, investigation into this boy's disappearance, plus numerous appeals for public to help, there has been no further sightings of Lee since that day he disappeared. None. He's literally just gone. His parents, Peter and Christina, have kept his bedroom till this day exactly the same. So that was an overview of the case. Now let's go into this very, very sad, unsolved case. Okay, so on the morning, and it was a Saturday morning on the 10th of September 1988, Lee left his home in southern Greater London, I think Chelms, to meet a friend about 11 a.m. in nearby Sutton. All right, so I've got the train or the bus or whatever he's got to nearby Sutton. Lee then spent a few hours with his mates, his friends. They'd done a bit of window shopping, and then they sort of parted company at about 1 p.m. When Lee was sort of parting company with his mate, he was leaving, just before he left, he said he might go to this Selhurst Park, this football stadium, to watch the match between Cheltenham Athletic FC and Millwall FC. So this may jog, because I know we have lots of football fans in England. This was 1988, and this was a match between them two. So if this part of it jogs your memory for any reason at all, then you should still get in touch and let people know what you may have some insight into what's gone on. But a football match is a really good indication. It can jog memories, you see, so that's why I wanted to really highlight that point. But that's where he said he went. Now, I don't know if actually he got there, all right? So, listen, there was appeals, wasn't there, on Crime Watch and everything out about this boy. You know, people were looking for this boy. There was Selhurst Park and other football stadiums also. You know, they tried everything to get people to come forward, but no one really could confirm any sightings of Lee at that stadium at that time. They just couldn't. So he may not have even made it there, okay? He may have thought he was going to go there, and something's happened between him leaving his friend and going there. Now, there was a witness that had come forward. Now, you know, when people like to try and help, so we don't know if this witness had come forward to say that she saw Lee at 2:20 p.m. still in Sutton, right? Because don't forget, he left his friend at 1 o'clock, said he was going to a football match. There was no sighting of him at that football match or at that stadium in that area at all. So we did have a sighting, or someone did think they saw Lee at 2:20 p.m. in Sutton High Street. Now, it used to be, I think, outside Tesco's in them days. It's now Asda's, or it was then. It could have probably changed again now since then, but it was now Asda's. And that was about 2:20. But so if you sort of take that into account, you think, okay, why did Lee say he was going to go to the football match, leave his friend at 1 and stay in Sutton till 2:20? Was he meeting somebody else? That's the question. Was he meeting somebody else? Or did he just think, oh, I can't be bothered to go to the football match, and this person that sighted him at 2:20, you know, he was just basically shopping and on his way home and disappeared? We just don't know. But the kick-off, you see, of the football was at 3 p.m. So if he was still in Sutton at 2 p.m. or 2:20 p.m, he had no intention of going to that football match. Right, so he had no intention of that. So we can sort of, even though I want people to still think about this football match and everything, and as I put these pictures up, if you recognise anything about Lee, but this boy literally has just disappeared. All right, so it's unlikely, I think, that he probably went to the stadium or even tried to go to the stadium, but it is more likely that he stayed in Sutton, probably to meet somebody else or met somebody else by chance, and that's what kept him in that area of that time. That was actually the last, if it was the sighting of Lee at 2:20 p.m. in Sutton on that day, that was the last sighting of Lee until this day. Okay, now this is where this case becomes interesting. Not just because it's an unsolved crime, but because we deal with a lot of cases of children, all right, going missing and things like this. And usually there's some sinister things behind this lad's disappearance, all right? I believe this. In 2012, a further witness stated that Lee attended an unofficial youth club in the annex of the Dunstan Church in Chelm, known as The Shed. Unofficial, right? This is unofficial youth club. These days you wouldn't be allowed to get away with that because we have things, you know, like you have to, you know, be checked out. But we're talking about 1988 and before, because this shed was running for quite a long time. This unofficial youth club. Now that's a worry in itself. Anyway, so following this extensive inquiry, the police found out that paedophiles were operating in the area at the time of Lee's disappearance. William Lambert, the St Dunstan's Church graveyard digger who ran the shed, was jailed for 11 years in 2011 when he was aged 75 for sexually abusing 4 girls who attended this unofficial youth club. Do you see where I'm going with this? Between June and September 2012, the police excavated part of St Dunstan's Church graveyard. I think, and this resumed again in April 2013. Now in 2013, this coincided with what would have been Lee's 40th birthday. Now Crime Watch again did a little thing on this, and they further added another appeal for information, as we are doing now, for further information because someone may know something. Now following this appeal, it was also alleged there was allegations of sexual abuse never before reported to the police, which are now a working theory that Lee may have died after intervening to try to stop sexual abuse in this unofficial youth club. Now, we're going to go into these links a little bit more because there's issues here, right? You have now an unofficial youth club being run by paedophiles, you know, in 1988. So there ain't no police checks being done here, right? There's no sex offenders register that these people are on at that time, or it was coming in at that time. There isn't any of that. You have a church that thinks it wants to help its people, and the church had nothing to do with this. This was a grave digger, okay? This was a grave digger and his friends. Then we had other gangs of paedophile gangs going around this area of London at that time, quite a lot, and they all knew each other, as they still do today. They all knew each other. Now, no one wants to get caught here, do they? Really? Anyway, let's get on with this case. Now, in 2008, Scotland Yard spokesman confirmed that a cold case detective, we do love a cold case detective, has interviewed potential witnesses, and new information is being investigated that could lead to Lee's body, right, or his remains being found. In 2019, Lee featured again in missing person campaign promoted by Italian football club SA Roma, right, or AS Roma. Now, we're going to talk about the paedophile, really, William Lambert. Now, let's just go back, leave Lee's case at that. Let's go back to William Lambert, who was 75, from Sutton, who carried out a series of attacks between 1985, what they know of, and 1987, while he was working as a grave digger at this Dunstan church, right? Let's look at him. Now, this paedophile, who persuaded his victims that he had magic powers. Now, that's what his ruse was, to get these kids to have sex with him. If they had sex with him, right, they would then get his magic powers. We are talking about children here. We're talking about children. This is what was going on, or part of what was going on, in this unofficial, youth club. This is what was going on in 1988. Now, these were 4 girls, I think, that he was charged and prosecuted for. Now, Croydon Council heard, that Lambert used his shed ground for this official youth club and preyed on vulnerable girls. Now, listen, in 1988, a lot of youth clubs were up and running, and still even today, for kids that are that need assistance. All right, they may not have a lot going on at home, they may be in trouble, this sort of different thing. And these youth clubs, and we have a lot of youth workers there that are amazing people, that really help build the confidence of these kids. It gives them somewhere to go, and stuff like this. We actually have places now called sheds, or the man shed, for people with mental health to go and use woodwork skills and different things like this. So this was 1988, this is not now, right? But in 1988, these were vulnerable children going to this unofficial youth club and being abused, and I think the girls were between 11 and 14. Now, when you think of a 14-year-old, and we think of a 14-year-old today in 2021, where they're a lot more streetwise, I think, a lot of these kids, than they were in 1988. Don't forget, the internet wasn't around, we didn't have mobile phones, you couldn't be ringing up people, we didn't know that all this was going on. So you have this man telling him he's got these magical bloody powers, and if if they sleep with him, then they can have their magical powers. And these people, or these children, were so vulnerable that they believed him, and he abused them. Now, it was one of them girls, I think, in 2009, she was in her 30s then, that came forward, and it was during a counselling session, I think, for a lot of her issues, but including this, the issues that this man left her with. And then officers from the Metropolitan Police were subsequently able then to track down other victims, and that's how then he was arrested. It's terrible, really, because we now know that if Lee knew this was going on, because this lad was a lad that would have helped, he would have tried to help. He come from a good family. He was a very nice looking lad, and you're talking about paedophile rings here now, right? So you may have had this Lambert that was into girls, but you may have other paedophiles that may have been into boys, and the other thing is probably what may have happened to Lee is that if he did try and intervene or stop something, that they murdered him. And I think that's probably the case here. And, you know, we're getting to graves and stuff, and, you know, when you have burying bodies in graves and stuff. Grave diggers today, and as we go into it, I think we'll save that for a bit later, that part, because there are rules with digging graves, and there are rules as how long they can be left open, this, that and the other. But in 1988, I don't know if they were enforced, and when you're talking about this boy may have been taken by a paedophile ring and murdered and placed in a grave. It could have been anywhere. Listen, Lambert was questioned, I think, I think it was about 24 years later after, you know, Lee had disappeared, he was questioned over it. And to tell you the truth, I don't know, you know, and it was even alleged that he could have murdered, or been part of who murdered Lee. But because he wouldn't give anything up, and we've had this with other paedophiles that we've had, they're only going to give you what you've got on them. You know, you have to fight and work for, you know, other evidence for them. Now, in 1988 and even in, you know, 2009 and everything else, it's difficult, isn't it, when you can't find a body. All right, you can't find a body, so they know now that he's dead. They knew he was dead, probably very good, you know. But if you can't find a body, you know this man has been charged with paedophilia, offences against children and everything else, and you probably know that he is part of this disappearance of this boy. But to have proof, to have evidence of that, it's very, very difficult. And a lot of these paedophiles, well, most paedophiles, will not name their accomplices at all. At all. They won't. Now, there was 3 men, I think 26 years after Lee vanished, probably part of some paedophile ring. 3 men, aged 41, 42 and 78. So I think we're looking at Lambert as one of them. There's also suspects in the conspiracy to prevent the course of justice and indecency with children, along with a 42-year-old woman. Now, as I've said before, we do a lot of cases on here where we have women, paedophile women. It's not just a men thing, and we are talking about if this woman was 42, you know, 26 years after Lee disappeared, then she was quite young herself. And I've said before that when paedophiles, you know, rings set up, they have a lot of kids either brought in to their circle or they're born into it. So, you know, she was a 42-year-old woman anyway. That was, and again, there's no evidence, and none of these people are talking. So that's then what's now left this case cold again, isn't it? So we've had little bits. Listen, it's very difficult to say precisely what happened to Lee, right? It is. But we can all assume, I think, from what's sort of come out over the years about Lee. Okay, so I think what evidence that the police found from these people they'd, you know, tried to find out if they'd murdered or had anything to do with Lee's disappearance. But what they'd done was these people had sort of said, and other people and other witnesses, as this police continued over the years to go through this disappearance, that Lee had been known to frequent this shed. Right now, it turns out that this shed wasn't just for all the vulnerable kids. The vulnerable kids then talk to other kids, and then you've got these teenagers that are a bit bored and think, oh, I'll pop down there because my mate goes down there and stuff. So they go down there. So now this shed becomes a lot larger in the people that were using it than first thought. Because Lee came from a very good home. Lee wasn't a vulnerable child. He had everything he needed. He had a great family and everything else. But he had friends that were vulnerable. And he had friends that went to this shed. And on occasion, it has been found out that Lee did frequent this shed. So this makes it more plausible now that Lee may have seen something had going on at this shed and tried to stop it, or threatened to stop it. I think it's getting more plausible all the time, this. Now, police even used radar. You know, I think they got it from the army radar, you know, ground penetrating radar, to see some of the graves, because look, you can't just go around digging up willy-nilly graves. But I think, you know, when you're a grave digger, now my dad was a grave digger. My dad was a grave digger for many, many years. In London, actually, and elsewhere, but in London. Not in this place, I'll tell you that now. But graves are dug quite deep. Now, if you buy a plot, that little plot, which is yours for a certain amount of time, you only buy that plot, right? And say you're going to have 1 or 2 people in it, that's sort of how dug, because the graves have to have so much between each grave, right? So, or each coffin. So say you've got a 2-person grave being dug. Now in them days, it would have been done, like my dad used to dig it by hand. I used to call him the Irish navvy. But he used to dig by hand, and he could dig a grave very, very quickly. They get, you know, they're good at what they do. Now, the graves are quite deep, and I know about graveyards because I grew up round them. You know, when my dad was working, we'd often pop down in the graveyards, and that graveyards are, for me, very peaceful places. But I think, now when I think back about when he was digging graves and the depth of the graves and stuff, and the distance that if he was going to dig it for a 2, you know, coffin grave, that it has to have so much between each coffin. It isn't piled on one after another. And the other thing is, when you have ground penetrating radar, if they put Lee's body underneath the coffin, and then put the coffin on top, right? It's, you know, would they still find him? I don't know if they would. I don't know if they would. And then you have the soil between that, then you have another coffin, right? Because, listen, this has been many, many years, since 1988, when this boy was, you know, went missing. If they had used a grave in this graveyard to do it, which I don't think they did use a graveyard in that graveyard. I don't think they did. I think they used it somewhere else, because he would have known other grave diggers and stuff. It's very difficult to find a body. And you can't just go, you have to have, there's, you know, laws, and there's laws, not, you know, not on the burial, but on the digging up. It's about the depth you can go down to. They may have known that, but we'll go into that in a little bit later on down there. But they did try and find, by using radar and stuff, they did check graves, because that's what they assume happened to Lee, is that's where his body was placed. We don't know. But in them days, it wouldn't be that difficult. Okay, so although there are laws, right, or regulations, should I say, on where a grave can be dug, such as not being too close to the water supply or drains. I mean, you can understand that, really, can't we? The legal requirement for the depth of it in the UK, a grave in the UK, is just recommended for a minimum of 1 metre of the settling soil above the grave to prevent disturbance, right? So you have to have 1 metre of it for settling soil. So if you're having then a grave that is dug for a double coffin, they would be a lot deeper than that, because they have to leave that 1 metre. Now, when a grave is purchased to take 2 full bodies, the depth of which the grave is excavated for the first burial must take into account the need for the second burial, the depth, and also this 1 metre at least depth to settle the soil. So we can, if you sort of look at that, you can sort of see, can't you, how deep some of these graves are. I think for the second coffin, there's no legal requirement as to how much earth must be left on top, right? But between them ones, there has to be a metre for that setting, or else it just sink in. So I think, so if you're going to say that you're going to bury a body, you really can't, because it's no physically possible to put an extra coffin in a grave without breaking the law. Do you see what I mean? I wouldn't have said that if someone was going to bury a body anyway through some criminal intent, that they would use a coffin. They would usually just put the body in the grave, and they would usually put the body in first and then cover that part of the soul. So when the coffin, the original coffin that's meant to go into that grave, is then placed in that grave, it's not noticed. And I think this is what may have happened to Lee, if this is the case of this paedophile ring, had buried Lee to dispose of his body. That could be it. Now, the Burial Act is an 1857 Act, and the Act is of Parliament in the United Kingdom. It is one of the Burial Acts from 1852 to 1885, and its purpose was to regulate the burial grounds. All right. So in this Act, or this statute, as we call it in England, it regulates of how the deceased's body may be buried, and it presides on how an exhumation of the remains can be removed. So in certain cases, and in cold cases, and we see a lot of this with cold cases, that they exhume the bodies, there's laws around that, and that's why you can't just go and dig up a grave. And this is why it's very difficult for these police to go and search every grave, because the law just doesn't, you can't just do that. This is sacred ground, really. So the Act made it illegal to disturb a grave other than for official sanctioned exhumations. So you have to have a reason. You can't just think, oh, there might be a body there. You have to have proof, right? You have to have proof. You have to think that body that you're exhuming going to have some DNA evidence on it, something that you need, right? There must be a reason. The Act did not make it illegal to steal a dead body. Now, we heard years ago that people used to steal bodies, or they used to dig up the graves, you know, to take the jewellery off and everything else. That's not what this is about. It is only, it's when you only open that grave up that constitutes an offence, right? So not the removal of the body, it's the grave itself that constitutes an offence, not the removal of the contents. So they sort of covered it in that way. The law is very strange. It's never straightforward, right? It's never straightforward, especially very old laws like from 1852 and 1885 laws in this country. It hasn't really changed much, to tell you the truth. I think it's section 25 actually of the Burial Act 1857 that makes it unlawful in England and in Wales to disturb human burials without a licence from the Secretary of State, or the ground consecrated by the rights of the Church of England without the permission of the church. There's a lot here that goes on. Right, now that was really about, because I think it's like a 100-year rule, isn't it? I think maybe a bit less, because as we now, our population comes bigger, and the graveyards, as you've seen, are, you know, getting smaller and everything, and churches are sold off. These graves really can't be removed until there's no person left, like 100 years, that everyone who's related to that person has died, and then can, so that grave, or, you know, the reuse of that grave can be used again for other purposes after that. It's about respect, I think, really. I think in Scotland the law is a bit different. I like to bring in all different laws. We're going to talk about the laws. The laws in Scotland are a little bit different. It's the Burial and Cremation Act, and that was 2016. The powers of the coroner permit exhumation falls outside the scope of the Burial Act of 1857. The Coroners and Justice Act 2009 allow them to authorise someone to dig up a body if they need to for the purposes of a post-mortem in relation to a criminal proceedings. That's it. Now, this 1857 Act has had amendments, and in 2004, as I said, because of our population growth and everything else, the lack of space, this is how now, you know, the burial laws and the policies in the 21st century have changed a little bit from what they did then. And so that's now how we can sell on and do things to graveyards that we couldn't do before. But as I said, there has been a long period of time that there's a lot in it. So if you're interested in that, they're the sort of laws that you can look at if you're more interested in the laws around the burials. But when we talk about Lee Boxell's case, we have to think these people were not law-abiding citizens, were they? These people didn't do anything. You know, if you're sexually abusing children and stuff, and you are paedophiles and you run paedophile rings and stuff like that, burial laws are not going to be your consideration, are they? You know, they think they're above the law. They think they can do what they want. And if you want to dispose of a body, the last thing you're going to think about is the law. But what you will think about is the depth of that grave, and if that body's going to be discovered. That's the things that a criminal would think about. Now, as I said to you, this is sort of an overview, I think, of Lee's case, because we just don't know. Listen, you had Jimmy Savile around this time running or being part of a paedophile ring, quite a large one. You had the gangs that I've spoke about before in other cases that were running around at this time as well, and Sidney Cook is one of the most notorious child sex offenders, I think, going. We also know that he likes to bury bodies. He likes to dispose of them, and some of them bodies that he's disposed of has never been found to this day. Was he part of this shed? We don't know. But there is links around that area to quite a lot of paedophiles going on and rings going on at that time. What I think happened to Lee and why we haven't found any sign of him at all or any evidence of him is that Lee stumbled upon something. Maybe he was going to say and report maybe the abuse to these children that was going on. He was a very nice lad, and I think he would have wanted to do the right thing. Maybe one of the people said, don't say anything, you know, don't tell your dad, don't tell your mum. So Lee thought him, because he was 5'7", even though he was young, he was only young, he probably thought he could handle himself with an old man, you know. But I don't think he realised what he was really getting into when you're dealing with these sort of perpetrators. I don't believe that we're ever going to find out what happened to Lee. I think we can only assume, and this is all assumptions on what we know of the disappearance of Lee. But when you disappear without a sight, with nothing, you've never been seen or heard of again since the day on the 10th of September 1988. This boy was most likely killed on that day and is buried somewhere. Now, if Sidney Cook or any of these other gangs, or even gangs like him, had anything to do with the disappearance of Lee, it is probably highly unlikely that we will ever find this boy's body. And it would only be by accident if someone does. So listen, if you found this case interesting, please, you know, give it a thumbs up, a like button. You can subscribe anytime you want. You can hit that, you know, bell that tells you about next case, all the cases coming out, and keeps you up to date. This case will be on the podcast Let's Have a Chat About Murder on Spotify. I'm going to do, because I've just started like doing little highlights of the cases on Facebook, so you can see what's sort of coming up rather than just the pictures. I'm going to use a bit of the clips of this case. Listen, this case is an old case, right? But you never know. Someone out there may have a conscience now. It wouldn't be one of the paedophile ring people, the main ones, but it may be someone that was linked to that paedophile ring unwillingly that comes forward with some evidence. Listen, this is a cold case. This is a very, very old case. But this boy deserves to be found. This boy's family deserve answers, either way. So if you have any information on what happened to Lee, or any information on what you think may have happened to Lee, please contact your local police and tell them what you think, what you know, or what you think you may know. Any bit of information to help with the disappearance of Lee would be greatly appreciated. So thank you for watching. So until the next time, bye bye.